Welcome everybody. I am Pam Thompson and this is our TreeMob today about Kolkwitzia or Beautybush, and our speaker is Michael Dosmann. Michael is the keeper of the living collections at the Arnold Arboretum, and Michael has been with the Arboretum in many ways, in shapes and forms, and he got a BS at Purdue in public horticulture. He has an MS in horticulture from Iowa State, and he has a PhD in horticulture and ecology from Cornell University. And without saying too much more, except that he is a fabulous asset for the Arnold Arboretum, let's just go ahead with Michael. And before I turn it over completely, I got to give a shout out to Steve Schneider, the man behind the video. And Steve is our Director of Operations and Public Programs. Thank you very much, Steve, and welcome, Michael.
Well, thank you, Pam. Certainly thank you, Steve, and the rest of your team for helping us to go virtual under what we are now calling COVID normal. It's a whole new reality. I did come prepared with my mask that matches my wonderfully beautiful Hawaiian shirt, but because everybody's practicing social distancing around here, and I know you're many miles away behind the screen, I figured I'd take it off so it didn't interfere with my my microphone. I love giving the tree mobs. There's something magical about being able to share the Arboretum's collections, individual plants with our visitors, and having that interplay, watching their reactions, hearing their questions, and being able to share this fantastic space. So launching in today about Beautybush, I certainly want to wax and wane a little bit poetically about this particular species, but I guess what I want to do is kind of talk about how I feel it represents so many different facets of being a museum object, an object in a botanical garden, and in particular, a little bit of that search for authenticity in our museum objects, which include botanical garden and arboretum objects. We're all collectors if we're gardeners. We all have things in our gardens that are just like art on our refrigerator wall or our refrigerator door. They're authentic in a certain way. And so trying to think about how we can share plants and their really interesting levels of authenticity. So that's a long preamble, but that's really what prompted me to think about why do I want to showcase Kolkwitzia amabilis, the beauty bush, today. You know, many folks probably have a Kolkwitzia or two in their garden, particularly if they're in a continental area. If they're from, particularly in the United States, it's a very popular species. If you're just looking at this beautiful shrub behind me, it's 90 years old, or 92 or 93 years old. About 12, 13 feet tall. It's got this beautiful arcing vase-shaped habit. We're capturing it just about at peak bloom. Usually we think around Memorial Day now in the 2020s as when it comes into full flower. 100 years ago is usually about mid to end June, but due to climate change, spring is arriving a little sooner. But it's just this beautiful display that is really unrivaled. It's got these small little trumpet-like flowers that are pinkish, rose, sometimes flush, bleaching out to a little bit of white. And if you zoom in, you can kind of see a little bit of these nectar guides, which will guide an insect into inside the flower so it can receive its nectar reward, and then with that, grab some pollen and move it to another flower, ideally even another plant, to start the reproductive process. Beautiful at this time of year. Now, then summer happens, and sometimes it becomes what some have even called kind of like a semblance of a green trash bag. Maybe not the most ornamental of species. It's got kind of a coarse texture and maybe leaves that are green, and green is a color, but maybe not that exciting. And then in the fall, there's not much fall color. It's a little bit of a ruddy brown or a tan, occasionally yellow. But the bark, if I step back a little bit, the bark is amazing. It's beautiful. With age, the plants tend to become a little shaggy. I'll step back so that Steve can zoom in a little bit. The twigs have a little bit of peeling character, and then when you get down in there into the actual stems, the canes, whatever you want to call them, it's a multi-stem species. You're never going to have just a single, and you should never prune it to just a single one. But it has that ornamental quality of shedding bark, which I think is quite attractive. Sometimes we horticulturists will call that subtle interest or quiet interest. That's when we're trying to really talk it up, its value. But it's great for showcasing in the winter, and especially if you've exposed some of that bark, kind of like how we've maintained this notable specimen here. Steve's got to zoom in a little bit with the flowers, and just to kind of talk about them. Yeah, you've got these clusters of flowers, inflorescences, and each individual flower may be solitary or in pairs. They tend to open up at the same time, and then those themselves are in smaller cluster or larger clusters. The petals themselves, there's 5 of them, and they're fused, so it kind of forms a corolla tube. You can see that the individual flowers are pinkish to rose, and they have that little bit of the speckles in the tube, which are those nectary guides of kind of the orangish yellow. And then you can even see on the outer part of the petals, and particularly in the throat of the flower, kind of a deeper rose color. And then if you look even beyond that, you'll see kind of some interesting little bristles or spinose bits at the very bottom of the flower, where it connects to the leaf or the petal stalk. Anyway, so those are some of the ornamental attributes of Kolkwitzia. It's been in cultivation for about 100 years and widely cultivated throughout particularly continental areas. So like I mentioned before, it's an old mainstay, an authentic plant in our gardens, particularly in the colder, drier portions of the world. It's hardy to zone 5, zone 4. Sometimes you'll get, depending on the zone 4 winter, you'll have some dieback and maybe some loss of flowers. But it's quite cold hardy, and it's quite drought hardy, drought tolerant. Less heat tolerant, maybe down to about USDA zone 8. But that covers a pretty large swath of the United States and other parts of the world. So when you think about how it has those drought and cold hardiness characters, if we think a little bit about where it's from, that helps to explain why it's such a thrifty plant for perhaps Iowa or North Dakota or Maine, not just Indiana, Kentucky, and Massachusetts. It's from East Asia, basically Eastern China to Central China, so that's why it's quite the thrifty plant. Thrifty meaning pretty tough. You don't need to water it, you don't need to irrigate it, except in extreme situations. It was actually introduced into horticulture in 1901 by Ernest Henry Wilson, extraordinary collector, botanist in the 19th and 20th centuries. And what was special is that he, in 1899, he went off for his first trip to China. Many of you know the story. He was questing after the dove tree, or the Davidia involucrata. While he was there, he encountered many other species. And when he was in western Hubei province, he encountered, well, he didn't know what he encountered, actually. He encountered a shrub. He described it as being 5 feet tall. He said he thought, and this was in late summer, early autumn, he said it was a 5 foot tall bush. Actually, he didn't call it a shrub. He said a 5 foot tall bush. And he said that it had potentially red flowers. It was in fruiting stage. Maybe it had a few, I don't know, remnant flowers, although I'm not so certain. But he suspected they had red flowers, and they had spinos, or what I would maybe call hedgehog-like fruits. But he collected some fruits, some seeds of this. He didn't have a name, but he thought it might be some type of abelia. Abelia being a genus that many gardeners are familiar with in the Caprifoliaceae, or the honeysuckle family. And so he collected it under that name, collected those seeds, sent them back to Veitch Nursery, his employer, in 1901. And what was interesting is that in the ledger that even Wilson had noted when he sent the seeds back, he said, I got to make sure I get it right. He said, yeah, he says, take care of this, with an exclamation point. Like, he knew this was of value. He had already collected Davidia, but he also was collecting these other things, including this plant. Didn't know what it was. He thought it was maybe an abelia, and made sure that he wanted to make sure that the nursery was taking care of it. So they germinated seeds. Seedlings become seedlings. Seedlings become small little shrubs. And in 1907, one of those shrubs shows up at the Arnold Arboretum under Abelia spa, because we still didn't know what plant it was at the time. Veitch didn't, Wilson didn't, and it arrived here in 1907. and was planted. We had a couple shrubs actually. One went in our old shrub garden, one went up on the top of Bussey Hill. Now the reason that Wilson didn't know in 1901 what species it was, he didn't know it was Kolkwitzia when he was out there in Hubei province, is because it was also described to science by a German botanist, Grabner, in 1901. So the paper came out in 1901, named after another German botanist named Kolkwitz, and those are based off of some herbarium specimens that were collected by some Italian botanists in the 1890s. So they had collected some herbarium specimens, shipped them off to a couple different herbaria, including the one in Berlin, and Grabner in 1901 gave it the name Kolkwitzia. So 1907, plant shows up here. Wilson, at that time, is actually under the employ of the Arnold Arboretum. So he had moved from the UK to Boston, Massachusetts with his family and was still collecting in China for the Arnold Arboretum. Because he had collected it in 1901, the plant had a soft spot for it. And he was quite happy a few years later when the plants, not only in the shrub garden, but the plants up in the top of Bussey Hill, the area called the Overlook, which we now call the Explorer's Garden, started to profusely bloom. Wilson was ecstatic. He waxed and waned poetic. You think I'm excited about this plant? No, no. Wilson, it was one of his favorite plants ever to be introduced. The predecessor for our quarterly magazine is called, our quarterly magazine now is called Arnoldia. Back in the day, it was called the Bulletin of Popular Information, which oftentimes included little facts about plants that were just coming into flower or maybe coming into fruit, new things, plants new to Western science, new to cultivation. And every single June, it seemed like Wilson would write about, oh my gosh, the Kolkwitsias never look better. Oh my goodness, it's never looked better. It's profuse. You know, he said that it was, one of the best things ever. I mean, he mentioned though that, what was it? 1927, it was interesting. He made this note. I had to write it down. He said that in 1927, the original plant, or at least the plant original at the Arnold Arboretum, which was from the original seed lot, has been much mutilated for propagation purposes. And from it, either by seeds or by cuttings, has originated the whole stock of the plant in America. So there was a plant up on Bussey Hill that was mutilated, mauled, because everybody was collecting cuttings off of it to grow, to root, promote in their nursery. We were distributing material. Everybody loved it. Certainly Wilson was promoting the heck out of it. And so hey, you get what you ask for. But he talked about how it was so mutilated. So that was in 1927. A few years before that, 1925 is when the plant behind me actually showed up at the Arboretum. And this came from one of those enterprising nurseries, Farquhar and Sons, R&J Farquhar, which is out in Dedham, Massachusetts, and it was, I would say, one of the leading nurseries in North America. In particular, it was promoting and selling the plants of the Arnold Arboretum. It was a pretty elite organization. They were also heavily engaged in selling the Regal Lily, but also machinery. You needed farm machinery, garden machinery, seeds, you named it. Their catalog was like the Sears catalog. So they actually grew second or third generation, depending on how you want to define it, seedlings from the original plant up on Bussey Hill and gave one back to us, or maybe we bought it. But that's the plant that's here from 1925. So it's basically 95 years old, and it's from Farquhar and Sons. So yeah, basically almost indirect from the wild. And he noted that when it was just 6 years old, 1929, 1930, it was already 7 feet tall and 9 feet through. So it's doing pretty well. The other thing that I got a kick out of Wilson always talking about, Wilson, this is one of his most beloved things. And he mentions, that he says, among the deciduous leaf shrubs that central and western China has given to American gardens, Kolkwitzia stands in the front rank. He felt it was ecstatic. But not everybody agreed with him, particularly a lot of folks in Europe, particularly a lot of people maybe in England, where it didn't tend to perform as well. And people said that it actually never flowered, that maybe it wasn't as good, or that they needed to do some fact checking to Wilson. And he was more than irate. And so he would publish in the Bulletin of Population about these rumors from abroad that it doesn't flower if it's a seedling. And he says, how can that be? Because the original plant was a seedling and all of these others. And he said he would call it these rumors and canards. He was quite angry with how some people in Europe in particular were treating his beloved Kolkwitzia. What he probably didn't know is that it's because remember when I said where it's native in that continental part of China where it's really cold in the winter, sometimes dry in the winter, but also prone to hot, dry summers. That's where it evolved. That's how it's adapted. That's how it performs best. If you think about the maritime climate of the UK, where it's not quite as cold, not quite as warm, really damp, the plant doesn't thrive as well. So, folks in the UK evaluating it might have just been speaking for what they were seeing. So that was 1901. He introduced it. It had never been collected from a horticultural perspective, where seeds weren't collected until basically 1994, at least in North America. There might have been another one that was collected in Gansu that's in Belgium right now, but in North America, in 1994, there's a NACPEC, North America China Plant Exploration Consortium. I know it's a mouthful, but it's a series of gardens and arboretum in North America that band together and collect and collaborate with sister gardens and research institutions in China to explore the flora of China, the plants of China, and collect herbarium specimens as well as seeds to introduce into cultivation. Well, in 1994, Peter Del Tredici, research scientist emeritus at the Arboretum, the time director of living collections at the Arboretum, Arnold Arboretum, was on an expedition, and he and colleagues from the Morris Arboretum in Longwood, as well as the U.S. National Arboretum, stumbled upon this plant in Hubei province, in Mudanshan, about 100 miles north of where Wilson was. Lo and behold, it was Kolkwitzia. And so they were happy. They collected material, seed, and distributed it to those different gardens to grow. And that was the second time that there had been an introduction to cultivation. Those plants, what's interesting, it's the Arnold Arboretum, we can air a little bit of our laundry. We had some plants from that original introduction. And sadly, in 1997, they were sold in our Arboretum plant sale out at the Case Estates by mistake. They were deaccessioned and sold. So somebody, if you're watching and you have a Kolkwitzia that you got at the Case Estates in 1997, let me know. So we didn't actually get to grow Peter's introduction of Kolkwitzia from 1994. But in 2008, we did get cuttings from some sisters of those that were at the Morris Arboretum. They didn't root very well. And I was a little like, oh no, what do we do? What do we do? But then I recalled that there had been a little bit of leftover seed. And so I contacted some friends at the USDA, the National Plant Germplasm System, and a great guy by the name of Jeff Karstens, who is at the North Central Regional Plant Introduction Station there next to Iowa State University in Ames, had done something pretty special. He had just a few plants, in about 17 plants in year 2000, 2001 that he grew out in there at the farm, at the station, grew them out. And as they got to be sizable, they started to flower. And I think it was 04, yes, 2004, they did a controlled pollination with all those 17 plants. They let the bees do the work, bees do the pollination. And so what they did is they reconstituted that original collection. In 2004, they harvested 6,000 seeds. He only started out with 17 plants. He got 6,000 seeds. In 2006, he harvested 36,000 seeds. Took a long time to do all of that work and a lot of effort, but one of the wonderful things that the Arboretum does is it shares the germplasm or the plants with other institutions. They share it. That's why we collaborate. And our enterprising scientists and curators at the National Plant Germplasm System are charged with maintaining this germplasm in perpetuity. And so he had 42,000 seeds. Some went to other gardens in Arboretum like this one. We germinated some. We've got 6 vigorous plants growing in our greenhouse just to my right that'll be planted out probably next year. Another several thousand seeds went for long-term seed storage in Fort Collins, Colorado, where they'll be under sub-zero temperatures and for hundreds of years, hopefully. And some also went up to the Svalbard seed vault up in above the Arctic Circle. So that effort from 1994 has really yielded a lot of fantastic plants in our gardens. some of plants that have gone into horticulture for evaluation, for breeding, and then also for long-term preservation. And I wanted to end on that note. One thing that also makes this plant so authentic, it's not just how beautiful it is. It's not just the story of Wilson and being one of Wilson's favorite plants. Um, it's not just the efforts of botanists, explorers, and horticulturists and growers and curators to maintain and bulk up plants and share them, but it's also a story of conservation. You know, 1 in 5 plants on Earth is threatened with extinction. It's pretty staggering. This is one of them. This is a pretty rare plant in China. I mentioned it's only been collected a couple times as a plant, maybe 40 or 50 times as a herbarium specimen, not too many. It's rare, it's threatened for a couple of reasons. One is the seed doesn't tend to set seed very well in the wild, maybe because there aren't enough plants, maybe a little inbreeding depression. Also, a lot of the habitat is lost. And so this institution, like all of our sister botanical gardens at Arboretum, we play a very strong conservation role where we're not just going out into nature, documenting plant biology and floristics and performance in the wild, but bring those under cultivation. But then also when we have that opportunity, we can bank the seed, doing it with particularly sharing it with places like the USDA so that they can bank them for long term and potentially even reintroduce them into the wild in case that's ever an option. So anyway, I just wanted to share why I felt that this plant is one of those that I feel is very authentic. You know, it's not just that plant that flowers at Memorial Day and might have nice quiet interest in the winter. Those are true, but it has this deeper story. And so a story of authenticity. And so while it might not be something that you can pick up at the local big box store, it might not be a proven winner, but it's proven in my mind because it is authentic and it has that story. And anybody who's growing one in their garden, I hope that they can recall some of those stories. In a couple weeks, you'll be able to watch it on YouTube and recall it and really share those with others. So with that, I'll stop the formal part of my my yapping, and hopefully maybe there's a question or two that Pam or Steve can reiterate this way. Thanks again for all of your attention. I really appreciate it. People tuning in from across the country or across the globe, appreciate it. With that, I'll turn it over to if there are any questions or observations.
We do have some questions, but first I want to do a screen share of your, full-size image of the flower. So I hope people can see that. If you can hear me, Michael, we have a question. Is the 1997 introduction similar to the original Wilson introduction, or do they differ?
That's a fantastic question. It's 1994. There's been only a subtle bit of comparison. Folks, our friends at the Morton Arboretum in Lisle, Illinois, they've been growing it. They didn't give their plants away at the plant sale, so they've been growing theirs for a while. And Matt Lobdell is the curator there, and his predecessor, Kunso Kim, and some of their volunteers and staff were documenting flowering. And they actually found that there was a subtle, maybe about a week difference in the flowering. And I believe the Wilson introduction flowered maybe about a week earlier than the introduction from 1994. But they were really collected only about 100 miles apart. What I'd be really interested is if we went out west of that range, out into Gansu province, which would be the northwestern part of its range. Imagine North Dakota, that type of a climate. If you were to collect plants from there, there might be acquired cold hardiness, additional drought tolerance. Also, if you went up to Shanxi province, where it was originally collected by the Italian botanist Giraldi, I think that those might also have some interesting variants. So yeah, they're genetically different. There was a study that showed that. They flower a little bit different, but I think we've barely tapped the surface of kind of looking at the variability. It's a great question.
Can you describe the fruits? Does it have berries or?
The fruits are, I would say they have quiet, subtle interest. They're dried capsules. The one thing, it's a great identification feature. If you're ever trying to identify Kolkwitzia in the autumn, and you could Google to find some images, they look like chicken feet. They look like hairy chicken feet. So that's kind of an interesting ID trait. If you're ever identifying it and you don't pick it up from the bark or maybe from the buds, which could look like dipelta or something else a little bit, but the fruits are very different from Dipelta, which is a related species. They're dry capsules that look like hairy chicken feet, and they're small. They're 1/4 of an inch to 1/2 an inch splayed out like a star.
Okay, and does it have any scent?
You know, I've never really picked up much of a scent. Flora, it's a little flowery, but it's not strong. It's not like Abelia. So some of you might be growing like Abelia mosinensis in your garden, which is so erratic you can smell it 200 feet away. That's what Wilson maybe thought it was in the same genus. Nah, this one, it's subtle. I don't have a very good nose though, so maybe others can pick it up. I don't know if anybody in the crowd has one and they've picked up scent, maybe they could chime in on the chat and say they've smelled theirs.
And how would you prune this?
How I prune it? I like natural form on plants, so I would plant it in an area where it can certainly get full size. You know, granted, this is almost 100 years old, but certainly these individual stems are not 100 years old. Most of these are probably 15, 20 years old, and occasionally you'll have individual stems that die back or get too old and they start losing some life. So you do a little bit of regenerative pruning. We're just kind of take out maybe some of those older stems, maybe even 1/5 of the year, and encourage some of this new growth at the base. So kind of keeping it in that rotation, we're thinning out some of the older stems and then allowing it to expand. This one's probably 4 feet wide at the base, and so it's expanded over time. And you can see a few small plants that are coming up, and some of those are actually some weedling cherries, and they're not actually Kolkwitzia, but there are some Kolkwitzias coming up in there.
So you're saying you would cut stems back to the ground?
Yes, and I would do that. I would thin it out after it flowers. If you're doing it winter, because the buds are preformed in late summer, early fall, if you pruned it in the winter or in the fall, you'd just be sacrificing flowers for the next year, which you're just sacrificing flowers for that next year. Usually what I would do is do it immediately after flowering. Do it in summer.
Okay, thank you. This is from 2 different people, but do we know who pollinates the plant and what's the wildlife value?
I've certainly seen a tremendous number of bumblebees. Maybe not tremendous, but I've heard and I've seen, I've probably heard more than I've seen, a number of bumblebees in here. So that I would say is the number one, probably honeybees and other, solitary bees. But what I've seen and heard are some bumbles. I don't know, Steve or Nancy, if you've seen any others on here.
Yeah, it's definitely bees.
But it's a bee. It's a bee pollinated plant. And so there'd be wildlife value from that perspective. The fruits, because they're dry and not really, there's very little to no nutrition value to them. So there wouldn't be any value for birds.
Okay, here's a report in on fragrance from Lisa Kissel, and she says that her plant is 50 years old or older, and it's quite fragrant.
Excellent. Well, Lisa probably has a far better nose than I do, or maybe I just need to get a better nose. Thank you, Lisa. I appreciate that.
And referring to the pruning question, what is the policy or approach of Arboreta? Are you not generally trying to show how plants grow naturally, within reason, of course?
I would say this is the natural form, and I don't know if is that wide enough people can see the full form, kind of that vase-shaped habit. If Steve backs up a little, if you could see it, I mean, this is the natural form of the plant. Yeah, perhaps with a little bit of a haircut here and there, but it's going to be a vase-shaped habit. The plant I've only seen a few photos of plants in the wild. The photos that were taken in 1994, the plants were young, only about my height, which is not that tall, and probably about 6 or 7 stems, and kind of still that vase-shaped habit. Yeah, if they were 100 years old, it probably and in full sun, mind you. A plant growing in shade is not going to be as robust as this, and this benefits from a little horticulture, but this is its natural form.
And is it related to Weigela?
It is. That's a great question. It is in the same family, Caprifoliaceae as Weigela. Within the honeysuckle or Weigela family, there's different groups. This is most closely related to Dipelta, which was flowering about 3 weeks ago or 4 weeks ago. The flowers look very similar, but the fruits are totally different. That's its actually closest relative, Dipelta. But the next cousin over, or a couple cousins over, are the Weigelas.
Someone says that their plant has grown quite big and they are concerned that a strong wind might topple it over.
I would doubt that would occur unless there was a compromised root system. If the plant wasn't healthy, then that's when I'd be worried about a strong wind toppling it over. You'd have to have a pretty strong wind to be able to topple something over at ground level that's kind of well anchored. If they are worried about that, maybe the individual stems are a little old and maybe not as healthy. They could do whatever, encourage it to produce additional basal suckers. Make sure it's well mulched, water it in, encourage some of that new growth, and get it in kind of a rejuvenative state. That would be better.
All right, and I think we're winding down here. One last question about this. Please reveal the location of this particular shrub for those who are local and can have a visit.
Yeah, well, I certainly encourage folks to come to the Arnold Arboretum if you have that opportunity. Don your protective gear. This individual plant is right along Bussey Road at the base of Bussey Hill and across from where the Dana greenhouse is. So this is, I would say, our #1 specimen, most beautiful. But there are other individuals. We have one that's actually a propagule off of the Wilson plant, and that's in our shrub and vine garden. It's not as old as this one, so it's not as robust, but that's a beauty as well. And then we also have one up in the Explorer's Garden. But really, this is the gem. This is the best one. And if you want, you can always log into our interactive map, and you can query, type in Kolkwitzia, and it'll show dots on the map of where they are. And this is accession, I think it's 18090A. But you'll be able to see right along the road of Bussey Hill, you'll see a dot.
All right, and here's one final question, and it's about your shirt. And who is the artist?
A friend of mine named David Shepard, Hawaii, I think if you Google it. He's a botanist at the Lion Arboretum, horticulturist, but he also does this on the side. And so I actually bought the shirt when he was just getting started. This is actually the first one that he made of this design. All of the plants are about Hawaiian native habitats or rare plants. And one of them featured here is a white poppy, a species of Argemone. And so they all have a conservation story. Part of the proceeds go to benefit conservation. So I've got a couple of these. I've got a green one with a fern, and I've got a grayscale one of these. And then I started buying the masks because the mask matches. And then he's been profiled just recently in the New York Times. So I think I got in just at the nick of time. Now they're going like hotcakes. But yeah, David Shepard, Hawaii, if you want to Google it. And it benefits a good cause. Some of the money, the proceeds go to benefit plant conservation, which is really important.
Well, wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pam. Thank you, everybody, for sitting in. Thank you, Steve, for being the camera person and the key grip and the best boy and all those other things that scroll at the end of the thing.
We'll make sure to have a long scroll for all of his jobs that he does. So thank you, everybody, for joining. And we will have another mob fairly soon. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Pam.
All right. Bye, Steve.
Bye, everybody.